it's his dignity itself that is the source of the humiliation that they see being inflicted on other people. And that it's the way that he presents his arguments with this veneer of politeness that is the most dangerous aspect of how he presents himself. And that it's that is the source of his real hate. In other words, he's a stochastic terrorist, just like I am, in the way that I deviously manipulate women into mimicking me by way of pretending that I think that women should take full responsibility for themselves. See how all that works? It's insane, actually. And I feel like I have the right to say that loudly and clearly, that a lot of these people are deeply mentally unwell. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Birth Bomb. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm Yolande Norris-Clark. I'm a wife, a mother of almost 11 children, a writer, a birth consultant, spellbreaker, energy medicine woman, poet, philosopher, and pretty decent, mediocre mom, according to most of my 10 children. I'm also, along with my husband and our kids, an Orthodox Christian catechumen on the path of faith and devotion, and we are being baptized this coming December. So it's exciting news. We just had that confirmed by our spiritual father, and everyone is giddy with excitement, and we're figuring out who we hope to have as our patron saints and godparents and things like that. So that's a highlight lately. This podcast, Birth Bomb, is where I explore a variety of topics that relate to birth, including God, emergence in general, self-healing, motherhood, womanhood, marriage, youth, aging, art, beauty, birth work, parenting, and politics, with the intention of not only inspiring critical thought, but to provide a balm for the soul. Birth really is the source of all, and our instinctive capacity to give birth and to be born encompasses the deepest power we've been granted by God. It's really thanks to the insights that birth has offered me that I know how bright the future is for my children, your children, and humanity as a whole. Oh, I actually wrote that a couple of years ago because I've basically taken a year off apart from last week's episode. And it's still true. It's all true. It's more true than ever, I would say. And if any of this strikes a spark, subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and join me on the journey. I'm also the author of the acclaimed Amazon best-selling book, Portal, The Art of Choosing Orgasmic, Pain-Free, Blissful Birth, which is available on Amazon. And the audiobook for Portal is being released very, very soon, so make sure you're on my mailing lists to find out when that's available. And of course, follow me on Instagram at @bahousewife if you're there. And I have a number of courses and seminars available on my website, www.yolandanorris-clark.com. And finally, I publish a weekly newsletter called What I Love, where I offer my weekly recommendations for books, films, art, homeschool curriculum, and objects, both sacred and profane. And you can find all of this, including my many free resources, in the show notes below. Well, it really has been quite the week. Once again, it feels like lifetimes have passed in a matter of days. Time really does seem to have accelerated once again, and in many ways, I feel really grateful for the fact that we're here in the tropics, in this sleepy little beach town where the pace of life is always slow and languid, and where our children get to run around barefoot, and where the issues of the world are really only accessed via the little rectangular chaos boxes that we all carry around in our pockets. But that's not to say that we haven't had our personal challenges lately, family challenges. I've recently gone through a pretty agonizing healing that absolutely tested my faith and everything else in a pretty big way. And I've just generally been moving through a season of grief for a multitude of reasons. And actually, this came up a little bit in a recent Instagram post that I made, in which I laid out the 5 rules that have kept romance and desire alive between me and Lee over the course of 20 years and 9 babies that we've had together. And I'm going to read the caption now, actually, because I want to unpack this a little bit, because I just found the response to what I wrote really, really interesting. So this is the caption, quote, "I showed Lee this reel before I captioned it." This is what I wrote on Instagram. "He is so adorable," which he is. "I asked Lee how he would describe our top rules for sustained intimacy over the years, and he, a man of few words, said, 'Make babies, not divorce.' And that's it in a nutshell. This has really been a great strategy for us. We do have mad chemistry, we always have, and that makes us very lucky, but that's not all there is to it. The following rules work for us and are foundational principles of how we've kept the spark alive. We've always lived this way, but since becoming Orthodox Christian catechumens, we've refined our values even more and found a deeper justification. These rules might help you too. Number 1. We strive to love God first and foremost. I fail continuously, and often I hate God, but the effort is something, hopefully. Number 2, monogamy. This is pretty basic. Yes, we've both been faithful all this time. No porn, it's abuse, violation, betrayal, cheating, and totally toxic. Number 3, no birth control. To be intimate means being open to the process of life. We feel this is deeply reflective of our faith and has contributed to the ease of our connection. Number 4, we prioritize fitness and health. Being fit, healthy, and strength training daily is an enormously important part of maintaining intimacy and desire, which translates to confidence and ease in our bodies. Furthermore, strength training balances men's and women's hormones and enhances libido and desire in a multitude of physiological ways as well. 4 years ago, I was at my heaviest and weakest, and I felt dissociated from my body, and this definitely impacted our marriage. I'm now 44, pregnant with my 11th child, fitter and healthier than ever, even more so than in my 20s. And I really want every woman to feel as vibrant and abundant as I do. And the truth is, you can. You probably have an idea of what to do in terms of lifestyle changes, but putting it into practice might seem daunting. This is precisely why I've created the Vital Wellness Fitness Masterclass for women who feel like they've lost themselves and their bodies in motherhood and who want to reclaim strength and vitality. Okay, that's the end of the caption. And incidentally, there is a link below for the Vital Fitness Masterclass and my longer program on completely transforming one's physique called Temple. But that aside, that was the post. And I thought it was pretty straightforward. And I really didn't think that there was much about it that would be controversial, but things got really interesting when one person wrote in to comment, and this is their comment. Number 1, which is striving to love God above all else, and also noting that I fail all the time and often hate God. Number 1 threw me for a loop. What if you said, I strive to love my husband, but often I hate him? Honesty points, however, but I would get curious about that love. To know Jesus is to love him. I hate sin and the pain of this world, and I bring it to him, to Jesus, with raw emotions of anger. Wrestling it out is hard, but often hating him, Jesus or God, feels off. Now, this comment really threw me for a loop, because to me it's just self-evident that every human being who professes to love God, who seeks to love God, who attempts to love God, also sometimes doesn't. Because to sin is to hate God. And that's not me being edgy or controversial. It's really just sort of basic, I don't know if it's theology, but I think it's basic human nature, because we are all sinners. So for someone to come into my comments and posture themselves as being shocked that I would confess to sometimes hating God, it really struck me a little bit. Because I'm a human being and I'm very flawed and I'm fallen and I sin and I resist God and I fail God in thousands of ways. And that resistance, my sin, my pride, it's not some dramatic, melodramatic declaration. It's just the reality of being human. And I found myself very struck by this person's apparent outrage. And this part especially about what if you said I strive to love my husband, but often I hate him. I do sometimes hate my husband. I mean, I have hated my husband, and I feel like that's quite normal. Hopefully I'm not alone in that. I mean, marriage can be really hard. Relationships can be hard. And if you've been married to the same person for 20 years and never once felt a flicker of frustration or resentment, or even at times outright hatred towards your spouse, then massive congratulations to you. But I also wonder if you're either lying or some kind of saint. I'm certainly neither. But this comment actually turned into its own thread. And someone else chimed in and said, I wonder about this as well. And then another person jumped in with Bible verses because now they're quoting scripture. And they wrote, quote, "You cannot love and hate God. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well." And then they went on to quote John 15:24 about how Jesus performed works no one else did and people still hated him. And then this person said, the Bible doesn't contradict. And yes, I know. I absolutely agree that the Bible doesn't contradict itself. But here's the thing. I'm not actually contradicting scripture whatsoever. I'm stating the obvious, that I am a sinner like everyone else, and therefore sometimes I hate God as evidenced by my sin. Because again, to sin is to hate God, whether we're conscious of it or not, I would say. Then this new person, went on to say in the thread, quote, "As a follower of Christ, that's so messed up," i.e., I am so messed up. But I actually would say that what's messed up is pretending that you're above the human condition. What's messed up is acting as though my honesty and transparency is somehow unchristian. I personally think that it's far less Christian to sit in judgment of someone else's confession of imperfection, right? And then here comes this gem, quote, "I free birthed my fourth baby, and when my fifth baby died in my womb, I still praised God. I never hated him. I will praise him with every breath." End quote. Well, good for you, honey. And I actually do mean that. And also, what a tragedy that your baby died, and I am truly sorry about that. But it's a very interesting inflection to then use that story, that experience, to denigrate someone else for simply being honest about their relationship with faith and the struggle and how they feel. I just it's unsavory to me somehow, but that's just me. I just don't actually think that someone's ability, whether it's truthful or not, to praise God in the midst of tragedy makes them morally superior, because there's nothing praiseworthy really about condemning someone else for being open and honest. And there's a particular flavor of Christian hypocrisy that really does rub me the wrong way. I have to confess that. And, the truth is that I am flawed and messy and contradictory, and everyone is. But I hope, maybe above all, that I'm not a hypocrite. I am certainly as much of a sinner as anyone else. And I mean, I sin in a multitude of ways, including my arrogance and pride and vanity. But I really definitely strive to avoid projecting that onto others in this particular way. So, to the multitude that are unremittingly self-righteous out there, I am a sinner and I am highly flawed. And if that shocks you, if it shocks you that I'm not perfect, then it might be time to take a look in the mirror, perhaps. I think the most bizarre comment in this particular thread was one from someone who wrote that they think I am deranged for saying that I hate God. And that, quote, "Often hating God is a crazy dangerous thing to say, especially as an online figure with millions of followers. Lord have mercy. Now, again, what it means to hate God is to sin. Disobedience to God is by definition hating God. This is not some wild, unhinged confession. It's really just the truth of what it is to be human. But being called deranged for simply admitting what is self-evident, again, about every single one of us, is so bizarre to me, and perhaps even verging on dangerously vainglorious for that individual herself. This whole angle of, well, you're an online figure, you have thousands of followers, you should be more careful about what you say. It's an irresponsible thing to say. Uh, it almost sounds as though this person is suggesting that I should be lying about my very real fallibility and my struggles, or that I should pretend that I'm some paragon of piety to make everyone else feel more comfortable. I'm never going to do that. And if anything, the fact that I have a platform means, in my view, that I have a responsibility to be real and to be honest and to say hard things. And if that makes people uncomfortable, which it clearly does, then maybe that's the point. Maybe we all need to be cultivating the capacity to sit in discomfort and to ask ourselves why it's so hard to admit that we're not perfect and that we fail and that we sin sometimes and that we might even at times hate God. Because I think if we're not willing to be honest with ourselves, then we can't possibly even begin to shift or change or really access true repentance. And I'm just not ever going to sanitize my humanity for the sake of the fragile sensibilities of complete strangers on the internet. In fact, as you might have gleaned, I stand for unrestricted freedom of speech. Now, this is not really a spiritual issue, but I think also in a way it is. And this topic has, of course, once again become a major flashpoint in the public conversation lately, especially with the tragic execution of Charlie Kirk, or depending on how you see it, the Oscar-winning performance of an execution, or depending on how you see it, the false flag political psyop, or the whatever it was. And although I alluded to all of that in my previous episode, I don't want to go any further into wading into that utter dog's breakfast, nor am I really interested in the granularities of what really happened, because absolutely no one knows. I certainly don't know. Candace Owens doesn't know, and she's never going to know. Probably the president of whatever country also doesn't know. There are so many nefarious actors at play in the world. We're just never going to know any of this. And in a way, it doesn't really matter. I don't think it matters. I think that question is one of the most, I don't want to say dangerous. It's not really dangerous. Well, maybe it is dangerous. Yeah, dangerous diversions from what is important, because I think there are elements of this event that are actually important, and I want to try to focus on that. There is no doubt in my mind that the publicizing of this event, and the way that this event has been received, and the figure and the persona of Charlie Kirk himself, has had a massive impact on the landscape of politics and publicity, and the question itself of what really constitutes free speech, and if and why this is important. And in the context of all of this and the various things that I've said publicly about Charlie Kirk and his presence and influence, I made a couple of posts on Instagram about it. I received a message the other day which I want to discuss and interrogate and kind of dissect here. If you're a mother, or if you're thinking of becoming pregnant, or if you're simply a human being curious about the nature of our origins, our purpose, and our connection to God, I want to warmly encourage you to check out my Amazon bestselling book, Portal: The Art of Choosing Orgasmic, Pain-Free, Blissful Birth. Part memoir and a chronicle of my own experience of giving birth to my first 9 children, part guidebook for women who are curious about exploring the possibility of pain-free, blissful birth, and part capacious, philosophical, poetic exploration of the power we have been granted by God to choose every thought, response, and reaction, which in turn orchestrates the shape of our lives. Portal is my love letter to humanity. It's the culmination of over 20 years of work as a birth consultant and a birth witness, and of course, my own experience as a mother of now almost 11 children. Portal is available now on Amazon.com, and if you happen to be among the thousands of people who've read it and loved it, I would be so grateful for your glowing 5-star review, which will help to continue to propel Portal into the hands of mothers who will benefit from it. This was one of those long, winding, pseudo-philosophical attempts at engaging in dialogue that unfortunately did end up being a bit more of a circular monologue, but it was very interesting nonetheless. And I want to say, too, that I do think that the person who sent this to me was genuinely seeking to engage with me in good faith. And that's why I entertained the conversation with this person. And that's also why I'm sharing it here, although, of course, I'm sharing it anonymously. And I really do appreciate, too, that this person remained civil throughout our engagement. But she also fairly quickly devolved into contradiction and recycled talking points. But I want to walk you through this nonetheless because it's really a fascinating case study in how people misunderstand, I think, the entire question of free speech, and frankly, how they misunderstand the nature of a debate or dialogue itself. So the message begins with this person saying, quote, "I think one of the biggest problems today is how polarized things have become. So few people can listen without sliding into hate speech." Now, right off the bat, I actually don't entirely agree with that. I don't actually agree that polarization is necessarily the problem. I think that distinction and polarization and disagreement are fine. I don't think that those are really the issues. I do think that hatred is a problem. But I also think that it's more an individual problem than anything else. And I really feel very strongly about the importance of free speech for this reason, because I think that polarization and distinction and clarity and a winnowing and the separation of beliefs and belief systems is totally okay. I mean, values are very important. I actually would say that, to my mind, the insistence on a kind of the whole melting pot concept has been an abject failure. And I think that's partly because there's been this sort of expectation that we should be filtering our beliefs and diluting our value system so that there's a homogenization. And I don't agree with that. So I would disagree with her initial point right out of the gate. So let me start again. Quote, "I think one of the biggest problems today is how polarized things have become. So few people can listen without sliding into hate speech. Even if I don't agree with all your views," she's talking to me, "it wouldn't make sense to reach out just to argue. At the end of the day, we're strangers. If we really disagreed, I could just unfollow quietly. I actually follow plenty of conservative voices to hear the other side, but with Charlie Kirk, it's different. I don't talk about racism specifically, but his comments were inflammatory against people I love. Palestinians, LGBTQIA+, Muslims. I opposed everything he stood for, but I never wished death on him or grief to his family." Okay. "Two things can be true. We can reject someone's ideas and still not dehumanize them." I absolutely agree with that, for the record. "What I don't get," she writes, "is why so many MAGA supporters saw him as a defender of free speech." I mean, I don't know what the connection really is between MAGA and Charlie Kirk. I think, especially in the past week, there are exponential numbers of people who would never call themselves MAGA, whatever that really means, but who also very much support Charlie Kirk and his family and also his beliefs and his position on a number of issues. But that aside, this last point that she makes is really the most important. Where do you draw the line between free speech and hate speech? And this is where it all breaks down for me. Let me repeat that. Where do we draw the line between free speech and hate speech? This very question is fundamentally flawed because it assumes that there is some sort of line, but there isn't. Free speech and hate speech, in my view, in my opinion, are not two sides of the same coin. They are not on some sort of continuum. They are antithetical concepts. Free speech, by definition, includes the right to say things that others might find offensive or repugnant or even hateful. The moment you begin to attempt to draw a line between free speech and hate speech, you have destroyed the entire concept of free speech. You're now talking about censorship, and censorship is the antithesis of freedom. The restriction of speech on the basis of the perception of hatred or the perception of an intention behind the words that a person is uttering that is negative is completely subjective and ultimately, by definition, authoritarian. But let me continue with this woman's message to me. She writes, quote, "Or is there really no such thing as hate speech because we're all free to speak whatever we want? We live in a world where children are being killed every day in Gaza, Sudan, Congo, and other places, but we don't see that much freedom of speech when it comes to stopping wars and genocides." Huh? I mean, this doesn't even make sense, and it's obviously not true. She's conflating two entirely separate issues here: the existence of free speech and the effectiveness of speech in stopping atrocities. People, in fact, are talking about wars and genocides all the time. The problem here isn't a lack of speech so much as a lack of action. I mean, speech doesn't drop bombs or send aid. Speech is often the precursor to action, yes, but it's not the action itself. So this point that she's attempting to make is really totally incoherent. And this, by the way, is really my primary issue when it comes to the number of people who continuously reach out to tell me that I'm a disgusting, terrible, bad, wrong person for not advocating for the children of Gaza. I mean, I've talked about this a lot. I've addressed this primarily on Instagram, among other places, but I do receive this kind of message all the time from people who are very upset that I'm not using my platform or using my voice to advocate for the children of Gaza. And, I don't talk about that issue. It's true. And that's because I have no personal connection to what's going on in the Middle East. I don't understand the dynamics of it. Of course, I'm against the killing of innocent children and the starving of innocent, of course, but there's nothing about me using my time or energy to say, stop that, don't do it, that's going to have any kind of effect whatsoever on the decisions that the world leaders who are in charge of all of this terribleness are doing. It just doesn't even make sense to me. And I primarily, I just feel like I have no authority to properly discuss the issue other than to say, don't hurt babies. But again, that to me goes without saying. But my words do have the capacity to impact the individual lives of the mothers that I serve in a more intimate way. And so that's where I'm going to focus my energy. And every act of service has a positive ripple effect that does alter the fabric of our world. And I just find it quite ironic that there are so many people who feel that they have the time and energy to reprimand me for not using my voice in the way that they specifically would like to see. And I just, this is a useless, again, circular, it's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. So this woman then asks, quote, "How do we push for more people to not pick and choose the human rights they stand for?" And what does that even mean? People do and always will pick and choose the causes they care about. First of all, I mean, that's how advocacy works. You can't fight for every single issue simultaneously. That's not humanly possible. So this idea that we should somehow universally align on all human rights issues or all purported human rights issues is naive. But it's also quite disturbing because what she's suggesting as well, what's kind of incorporated into this statement, is the idea that her understanding of human rights is the objectively correct one. And I don't agree with that. I have a very clear framework that I'm operating from. And frankly, it's a very similar framework to the one that Charlie Kirk was operating from. And it's very clear that this woman sees Charlie Kirk's perspectives and his understanding of the framework of what constitutes human rights as deeply flawed, perhaps even hateful. And so what this woman is revealing, what she's writing to me, is a kind of leftist fundamentalism, that she sees her view as the correct and objectively right perspective. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that. I see my view as as the correct and objectively right perspective too. But at the same time, I recognize and respect that other people won't agree. And that's not a problem for me. But it seems like a problem for this particular woman and for a lot of people that I'm observing who come from the so-called woke left. So, to go back to what I was saying before, to go back to her reason. I don't think so, but you know what? When I'm done with this, I will come down and read you a story, okay? Can you pick a story for me and put it on the coffee table and have the story ready? You go down and pick the stories.
Are you gonna be 1 minute?
I'm gonna be a few minutes, but not too long. And as soon as I'm done, I'll come right down and read stories to you. Okay. Okay. I love you. Go pick the books. So, I stand for what I see as inalienable, intrinsic human rights based on biblical principles which align with, as I see it, natural law. Now, I also believe that people should be free to pursue whatever kind of lifestyle they choose. And I don't think that there's any contradiction there. And that also doesn't mean that I don't have my personal pet causes and projects that I have to choose to advocate for over and above others. So at this point in this conversation, I responded to this woman and I wrote, I stand for freedom of speech, which is incompatible with the idea that some speech should be prohibited on account of being hateful. Because who decides what constitutes hate? And how can such a thing be rightfully legislated? The very idea of hate speech is a totalitarian concept, and it is antithetical to free speech. I go out of my way personally to be respectful and courteous to everyone, and I don't always succeed, but I try. Nonetheless, there are people who sincerely believe that I am a white supremacist, a misogynist, and a hate monger, just as there are people who see Charlie Kirk as all of those things. Freedom of speech means upholding the right to offend, to hate, and even, in my view, to threaten, although I understand that there's a contradiction there with U.S. law, even. In any case, the only effective way to combat hate, again, in my view, is to allow it to be aired, processed, and responded to in the context of free and open dialogue, or ignored entirely. Censorship only foments tension, resentment, and potentially dangerous underground movements. And at this point, the woman responded, and she wrote, "Thank you for sharing your take. I find it thought-provoking. But the question I keep coming back to is, where exactly do we draw the line between hate speech as part of open dialogue and when it crosses into becoming an act of hate or even violence?" So at this point, I'm starting to wonder if she's really even capable of apprehending what I'm expressing, right? Because she's now just repeating herself and kind of there's a sense of cognitive dissonance here, right? It's like she's not capable of hearing me, of understanding what I'm trying to express. So again, we're back to this idea of the line. And the line is drawn, in my view, when speech ends and action begins. That's the line. It's that simple. It must be that simple, because words are not violence. Words can indeed inspire the desire to do violence, but the responsibility for violent action lies with the person who commits the action, who takes the action, not the person who speaks. I mean, sometimes they're the same person, and that's a different story. But the line is between the speech and the action. And this is basic personal responsibility. If someone hears inflammatory rhetoric and decides to act violently, that's their responsibility, not the responsibility of the speaker. And now this woman responds to me, and she writes, if someone says LGBTQ people are a threat to kids and that they're hypersexualizing children, and I mean, just an aside, I think this is often the case, actually. I see this all the time. That's my perception and my belief. But that aside, this woman goes on to say, maybe they think they're just throwing an opinion into the mix. But the reality is that exact framing has already been used to justify attacks, end quote. Right. Well, as I said, I do believe that there are many, many individuals who consider themselves part of the so-called LGBTQIA++ community who are indeed sexualizing children, who are indeed engaging in a kind of grooming process. I think that's absolutely true. But I'm not going out there physically attacking LGBTQ people at all. What I'm doing is keeping my children far, far away from them. I am boycotting their library drag queen story hours, and I'm speaking out against what I see as degenerate behavior. I'm not attacking people. It's pretty simple, really. Like, this is the line. The line is between the word and the act. And this is where we really hit the crux of the issue, because this woman is arguing that words can justify violence. But this is precisely why freedom of speech is so important. If you suppress speech, you don't eliminate the underlying sentiment. You drive it underground, where it festers and grows unchecked. The solution is not censorship. It's more speech. It's expanded speech. We counter bad ideas with better ideas. We expose so-called hateful rhetoric to the light of reason and debate, and this is how you combat it. That's it. Tearing during birth is one of the biggest fears that new mothers have about the birth process itself, and for very good reason. A severe perineal tear can cause immense pain and discomfort postpartum, and it can also affect our body image, our sense of self, and our intimate relationship. And yet so much of the advice you'll find out there about preventing tearing is ineffective or downright counterproductive. There is, however, a formula for optimizing your chances of not tearing during birth, and I've created a course based on my 24 years of experience, including the births of my own 10 babies, to support mothers in choosing the kind of birth that is truly easeful and that you can emerge from intact and integral. The program is called Integral, and it's a deeply insightful, practical, actionable course that will give you the tools to choose a birth in power. The link is in the show notes. But she goes on, quote, words may not be physical violence, but they can justify it, normalize it, and make it inevitable, end quote. No, I passionately disagree. Words do not make violence inevitable. Absolutely not. Humans sometimes make violence inevitable because we act in violent ways, but words are abstract. Yes, they can be compelling. Yes, they can be persuasive. They may even be arguably dangerous, but they are not actions. And the moment we start blaming speech for violence, we open the door to endless censorship and the total abdication of personal responsibility. And in the end, this entire exchange between myself and this woman was a perfect example of why free speech is so critical and of why and how so many people misunderstand it. Because free speech is not about comfort or safety. It's about the often infuriating process of allowing all ideas to be aired, even the ones we despise, because the alternative, censorship, suppression, and the illusion of safety, is so much more dangerous. And this is something that I just feel so strongly about. I feel so strongly about this because I can see how this misunderstanding is being used to create the very surveillance state and the very contracted existence that is now an unfortunate reality in places like the UK and Canada, the country we left almost 6 years ago that I have no desire to ever return to. And this conversation that I had with this woman is just one of many that falls into the rubric of people who have reached out to me trying to reason with me, trying to explain, sometimes painstakingly, often condescendingly, that my perception of Charlie Kirk as a person, as a thinker, as a debater, as a speaker is fundamentally wrong. There are just so many people out there who seem to believe that if they could just make me understand why what I believe is incorrect, of why I've somehow missed the boat on Charlie Kirk and like I just don't get it. I just haven't managed to get it through my thick skull that he really is actually a racist. If they could just try to kind of reason with me, that I would somehow come to my senses. And again, the cognitive dissonance is so strong in that these people genuinely think that I have simply failed to like encounter the right material that shows that Charlie Kirk is this dangerous, hateful, actively harmful person, then I would somehow wake up. And every time I've been approached by people who think along these lines, I ask for evidence of Kirk's supposed harm, of the harm that his ideas did or that his rhetoric inflicted. And the response is so, so interesting. And what I've consistently heard is that the proof of Charlie Kirk's dangerous rhetoric, supposedly dangerous rhetoric, is the fact that certain people feel harmed by it. And really, this is at the crux of how so many people on the so-called woke left, I don't know how else to describe it, so I'm just going to keep using that term. But this is really at the crux of how so many people who occupy this position are operating from, whether it's gender, racism, or now apparently the moral character of this individual, Charlie Kirk. They're all circular arguments for which there isn't even an attempt made to anchor in reality. And they're all arguments that hinge on identity and feeling and emotion. And while those things are valid on a personal level, they're valid in terms of one's interior life, they're not valid in regards to an open public debate or the public conversation. And what it reveals is that the entirety of this woke left ideology, and it is an ideology, is, I think, rooted in trauma. Now, here's the thing. Over the past week, it's been a week now since he was killed, I have actively searched for what I consider to be evidence of Charlie Kirk's dangerous, hateful rhetoric. I have spent hours, honestly, listening to his debates and watching his encounters with people who disagree with him. And I have to say, Charlie Kirk was brilliant. He knew American history inside and out. His opinions were incredibly well formed, well reasoned, and very well articulated. But what really struck me more than anything about Charlie Kirk was his unflagging respect for his debate opponents. I watched him debate college students, respond to critics, and I observed him handle some of the most unhinged, incoherent, and frankly abusive people that you can imagine. And one of the most impactful moments that I came across during this deep dive was actually his appearance on a podcast called The Whatever Show. Now, I'd never watched this show before. I wasn't familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, let me paint a brief picture. It's a chaotic, cringe-worthy show that seems to thrive on descending into shouting matches and general degeneracy. The typical panel seems to be a mixture of porn stars and leftist ideologues who argue with right-wing people. Again, left and right doesn't really mean anything, doesn't really matter, but the purpose of the Whatever Show seems to be to create immense drama and controversy and conflict. But Charlie Kirk's appearance on this show, I found extraordinary. It was one of the most stunning examples of compassion and honestly Christ-like love I have ever seen in the media. Maybe ever, but certainly in a long, long time. Charlie Kirk enters this scene, this kind of lion's den, surrounded by a group of very, very young women, most of whom are involved to some extent in the adult film industry, and they proceed to do their best to provoke Charlie Kirk, to get a rise out of him, to humiliate him even. And all they really succeed in doing is humiliating themselves in the process. But it's so evident that these women are just radiating this latent rage and trauma. And there's one young woman in particular, and I will link to the show in the show notes. It's difficult to watch, but it's also quite edifying, really, because Charlie Kirk is so incredibly kind and compassionate. But this one woman really just takes things to another level. She's not just trying to provoke him emotionally, she is actively attempting to sexualize the interactions that she has with him. She's posturing herself in this way that's just so brazenly uncomfortable to watch that it really is utterly cringe. And I mean, watching it is painful, but I can't imagine how it was for Charlie Kirk. He's sitting right next to her. And yet, Charlie Kirk does not take the bait, not even once. Instead, he responds with this incredible kindness and just what seems to be unshakable dignity. And it's not just that he maintains his own composure, though he does do that beautifully. It's also that he manages somehow to dignify these young women. Every single response he gives to their questions, their leading questions, their embarrassing questions, he somehow manages to respond in a way that just elevates the energy in the room. It's almost as though he's reaching into this broken, chaotic space and just suffusing it with compassion and grace. And I've really never seen anything like it, honestly. If you're a busy mom like I am, juggling meals, laundry, bedtime stories, homeschooling, or school drop-offs, all while trying to find a moment to breathe, I get it. And I know very well from experience that especially when we're in the midst of full-on mothering, what can often fall by the wayside is our own bodies. I also know exactly what it feels like to look in the mirror and feel like a stranger in your own skin. 4 years ago, after giving birth to my 9th baby at the age of 41, I woke up one morning weighing nearly 180 pounds and with every symptom of so-called perimenopause. I felt disconnected, overwhelmed, and frankly, almost defeated. And it actually crossed my mind that maybe this is just what happens. Maybe this is the stage of life where I just have to accept that weight gain, brain fog, exhaustion, and that sense of feeling at the effect of my body was now normal. But I've never really been especially compliant when it comes to questionable societal narratives, and I decided instead to quietly embark on a personal experiment, an adventure, a quest, if you will, to discover if it were possible to not only lose weight, but to completely reimagine my relationship to food, movement, strength, and my own sense of embodiment, and to radically transform my body composition. And it turns out that it worked. Now, at the age of 44, I am in the best shape of my life, and I have completely eradicated all of those symptoms of so-called perimenopause. That journey led me to create Temple. Temple is not just another fitness program. It's not about quick fixes or cookie-cutter meal plans. It's about you, your mind, your body, and your spirit. It's about understanding the deeper reasons why we get stuck, why we struggle to create lasting change, and how to break free from patterns of self-sabotage for good. In Temple, I'll guide you through the exact, practical, and metaphysical steps that I took to nourish my body and to learn once again to move with purpose and to build strength, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. More importantly, I'll help you rewrite the story that you've been telling yourself about what's possible for your life, which will inevitably result in dramatic physical changes. What I want more than anything is for every woman to feel as vital, vibrant, strong, flexible, and alive as I do, and I know that it's possible for you as well. Join me in Temple. I can't wait to see you there. Link is in the show notes. And as I mentioned on my last episode, I wasn't even aware of Charlie Kirk's existence before. He was not on my radar. But after watching this exchange, especially, and many other clips of him engaging with various people, I really found myself feeling a deep sadness over his loss. It really does feel like a tragedy. And I think there's some hyperbole happening in the media, of course, in every direction on the issue of his death. But apart from the conspiracy theorizing, apart from the attacks from what we might characterize as the left and right, although again, none of that really matters, I also see that so many people have truly been inspired by Charlie Kirk, inspired to speak boldly, inspired to embrace Christ, inspired to go back to church, inspired to engage in what I think are very important debates, but to do so at least with an attempt to be courteous and loving and compassionate. He was really quite incredibly polite. He was remarkable. I think he was remarkable, and I think that is why there is this overwhelming outpouring of love and grief and sadness and also a kind of righteous anger that I think is legitimate. I really do. Whatever the true story of his death might be. And again, I find myself truly baffled that anyone could spend any real time watching his debates and not at least appreciate that he's debating in good faith. Because it's not just that he's not cruel or condescending or even offensive, even when he's discussing topics that are highly, highly emotive and polarizing. It's that he is stunningly courteous and respectful and polite. I have really seen very few examples, if any, of him ever trying to humiliate anyone, and yet it would be so easy to do so. And his opponents do such a great job of humiliating themselves. It just, it doesn't make sense to me. I fail to comprehend it. And it's interesting that despite his death, everything he stands for is out in the open. I mean, it's all there for anyone to examine. But to take this issue further, what I'm noticing also among people who are trying to convince me that he was a bad person is that his decency and his charm and his politeness are actually being twisted and being used as evidence of his supposed manipulation. So there's a cohort of people who are so eager to attribute to Charlie Kirk the very worst possible intentions that they're actually twisting his character into something monstrous based on nothing but ideological projection. Now, I think they have that right because, again, I support free speech. But this, again, is also why free speech matters so much. Because if we're not in a position to hear all sides and to examine all ideas and to follow these lines of thinking to their source, then we're left with this terrifying notion that someone, some institution, some body of people, a group of experts has the right to dictate truth. And the idea that certain speech constitutes literal violence, that certain ideas are inherently harmful, this is the premise that underpins every argument for censorship and totalitarianism. Now, one of the concepts that someone from this ideological framework came to present me with was the idea that Charlie Kirk is a stochastic terrorist. Now, I'd never heard of this term before because it's been 25 years since I studied critical theory in the Frankfurt School and postmodernism at university, and so I'm out of that horrifying loop. So I had to look this term up, and my goodness. Stochastic terrorism, if you haven't come across it yet, is the idea that certain forms of inflammatory speech, even if it doesn't directly call for violence, can increase the likelihood that certain groups will lash out in certain ways. So it's not a direct incitement to violence, but it's a subtle incitement to violence. And so it's a way of radically expanding the responsibility for violence that creates this sort of through line of fantasy, I would say. I would call it fantasy. And again, I hesitate to call this the weaponization of language because I don't want to replicate exactly the kinds of weaponization of language that I'm referring to, that I'm critiquing. But this idea of holding someone responsible for another person's unpredictable act, whatever that might be, is incredibly disturbing, if not outright dangerous. I mean, it's one of those terms, stochastic terrorism, that sounds very academic and specific, but when you actually dig into it, it's so nebulous that it could be used to accuse literally anyone of anything. It's like handing someone a blank check for moral outrage. You don't like what they said? They're a stochastic terrorist. It's essentially a catch-all for thought crimes, which is, I mean, Orwellian to say the least. And here's where it gets really interesting because stochastic terrorism, this idea, this concept, is its own form of stochastic terrorism. It's just it is an endless tautology. It is the definition of a tautology. It's this sort of weird self-perpetuating cycle, like an intellectual feedback loop that just keeps spinning, getting more absurd with each rotation. It's like a game of broken telephone where every iteration gets further removed from reality until you're left with this totally fabricated fantasy world. And I was talking about this concept with our almost 17-year-old who had come across this term before, and he called it a cognito hazard. It's almost like a mental virus. I mean, it's so vague, so circular, so inherently flawed that it's utter, complete nonsense. So I reject the idea of stochastic terrorism altogether. But I also realized that this is essentially what people are continuously accusing me of. I think this is the perfect term for how others perceive me in the birth space. This is essentially the accusation that's being made towards me all the time. I constantly get people reaching out to me who will say things like, yes, they're aware that on the surface of things, I don't offer medical advice, that I do verbally reiterate to women in all of my products and courses and seminars and on my podcast that I'm not offering medical advice and that everyone is responsible for their own choices, and that I certainly don't advocate for anyone to blindly follow me, but that nonetheless my carefully cultivated aura and my mystique and my deliberately nurtured charisma has been deviously designed to covertly manipulate women into following my lead and in the end killing their own babies. And this is exactly what I'm seeing and hearing people accuse Charlie Kirk of. That it's actually his politeness and his courtesy that are the most manipulative elements of his personality, his cult of personality, and that it's his dignity itself that is the source of the humiliation that they see being inflicted on other people, and that it's the way that he presents his arguments with this veneer of politeness that is the most dangerous aspect of how he presents himself, and that it's that that is the source of his real hate. In other words, he's a stochastic terrorist, just like I am, in the way that I deviously manipulate women into mimicking me by way of pretending that I think that women should take full responsibility for themselves. See how all that works? It's insane, actually. And I feel like I have the right to say that loudly and clearly, that a lot of these people are deeply mentally unwell. But not only that, I think a lot of these people are experiencing a kind of demonic possession, and that what they need more than anything is God. And the invitation that God, Christ, provides to actually step into a position of self-responsibility, because that's really what this is all about. And that's really what Christianity is all about. The greatest gift that God provides to us, that God gives us, that Jesus brought to this world, was the power and the awareness of our power to actually choose. I had a conversation with my 3-year-old the other day, and actually this is on video. I was recording at the time, and we just managed to capture this very spontaneous conversation. And my 3-year-old said something, I forget exactly what the experience was that he was describing, but it was some scenario in which he acted poorly. And he said to me, "Mom, the devil made me do it." And I said, this is very interesting, my sweet one. That's not actually how the devil works. The devil does not ever make us do anything. Rather, the devil invites us to succumb to the temptation to do wrong things and to lie and to steal and to cheat and to betray God and to hate God, in fact. Anyway, what a tangled web we weave, and what a mess the world is. And this is precisely why I need God. And this is, I think, why we all need God. And this is also why it's not just that I need God, it's also that I need the structure and the discipline of the church and the Orthodox Church in particular. And so, anyway, I'll leave it at that because it's getting dark, and I'm hoping that this recording worked out. And excuse my messy bedroom in the background. And thank you for being here. And I look forward to chatting with you next time. Okay.